Trump's press secretary responded to the reporter. The reaction made him unexpected. The stage was set for an electrifying live interview. The lights overhead cast a sharp glow. The audience murmured in anticipation. The cameras zoomed in on the host's desk, where Caroline Leavitt, White House press secretary, sat across from a determined reporter. Both were aware of the stakes. This wasn't just a regular interview. This was a confrontation. Caroline adjusted her microphone, her composure unwavering, though her mind raced. The story had been building for weeks. The media had been relentlessly criticizing the White House, calling for more transparency, more accountability. Now, they had the chance to question the woman who represented the president's voice. She had prepared herself for this moment. After all, Donald Trump had made waves, and she, as his spokesperson, was expected to carry the weight. She had done it before, but there was something different today. The cameras, the pressure, the critical eyes from the audience, it all felt a little more intense this time. As the host introduced her, she gave a brief smile, nodding at the camera. Her calm demeanor betrayed nothing of the storm brewing inside. Next to her sat the reporter, whose role was clear: to expose flaws, to challenge, to push back. The moment the broadcast began, the room fell silent except for the host's voice. He gave a brief overview of the administration's recent moves before turning to Caroline. Caroline, the public has been asking questions about the lack of progress in some of the White House's promises. How do you respond to the accusations that your administration has not lived up to expectations? Caroline leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but measured. The president has been delivering on his promises, she began. The issue with the bureaucracy has been long-standing, but we're addressing it. For years, systems have been broken. Now, the president and Elon Musk have drawn attention to the deep-seated inefficiencies, shining a light on the truth. The reporter's eyes narrowed, sensing an opening. He leaned in, ready to strike. But Caroline, he said with a sharp tone, how do you justify the millions spent on projects that seem to have no clear benefit to the American people? For instance, the $50 million for, let's say, controversial programs? The question landed with a thud. The room seemed to hold its breath. Caroline took a moment before answering, her gaze steady. The president is committed to transparency. We're exposing the corruption and the waste that have been ignored for decades. And I can assure you we have the receipts. There was a pause. The reporter was visibly taken aback. He had expected her to falter, to hesitate. But Caroline had rehearsed for this. She had anticipated the questions. She had expected the criticism. Well, let's see those receipts then, the reporter challenged, a sly smile playing on his lips. If you claim transparency, we're all eager to see it. The tension in the room thickened. Caroline's heart rate remained steady, but she could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just an interview. This was a battlefield. And Caroline, armed with facts and unwavering resolve, was ready for the fight. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. The reporter's challenge hung in the air like a weight, the words echoing in Caroline's mind. If you claim transparency, we're all eager to see it. Those words struck a chord. He wasn't just questioning the administration, he was questioning her integrity. And Caroline Leavitt, no stranger to scrutiny, wasn't about to back down now. She looked directly at the camera, her expression calm but resolute. The lights overhead shone brighter, casting long shadows across the studio, but she was used to this. The eyes of the world were on her, and at that moment, it didn't matter how many cameras were focused on her. All that mattered was the truth, and making sure the American people understood that the fight for transparency had just begun. We're working on something big, something that has been ignored for far too long, she replied, her voice steady. For decades, government bureaucracy has been allowed to operate without accountability. President Trump and Elon Musk are making sure that changes, and we have the data to prove it. The reporter raised an eyebrow, as if he hadn't expected such a bold answer. Data, huh? I'm sure the public would love to see this data you're talking about. After all, if you're promising transparency, it's only fair to deliver, right? Caroline's eyes flickered briefly, then locked onto his. There was no room for hesitation. Of course, she said, her voice even. We've already begun providing that information in the briefings, and will continue to do so. But what you fail to see, what many fail to see, is the system we're up against. It's been built to hide the truth. The reporter leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, as if to signal the beginning of a new line of questioning. So, are you saying that the previous administrations were intentionally hiding things from the public, he asked, his tone accusatory. That's a pretty bold claim, Caroline. I'm not saying it was intentional, Caroline replied, a trace of impatience in her voice now. I'm saying it was inevitable. When you have systems that are this broken, when you have people who are so entrenched in their positions of power, the result is always the same: secrecy. It's the only way they can continue to waste taxpayer money without anyone noticing. The reporter narrowed his eyes, clearly not satisfied with this answer. He turned his gaze back to the audience, as if inviting them to share in his skepticism. The camera panned out for a brief moment, showing the faces of the viewers at home, most of whom were on the edge of their seats, watching the showdown unfold. All right, the reporter said after a moment, shifting gears. Let's talk specifics, shall we? You mentioned the waste and corruption. Let's get into that. You say your administration has uncovered the misuse of funds. Can you explain to the public what exactly you're referring to? Caroline felt the weight of the question, but she was ready. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Yes, absolutely. One example is the spending on federal retirement systems. We found that millions of dollars were spent trying to modernize a system that wasn't even close to being ready for a digital upgrade. And what did we get in return? A massive failure that has left millions of Americans in the dark about their own retirement funds. The reporter's eyebrows shot up. A digital upgrade for retirement paperwork? And you're telling me this failure somehow escaped the radar of the mainstream media until now? Exactly, Caroline replied. For years, the system has been inefficient, and no one has dared to challenge it. We're the ones who are shining a light on it, and it's not pretty. We're exposing it, and that's why President Trump and Elon Musk are working together to fix it. There was a brief silence as the reporter processed her words. Caroline could feel the audience's eyes on her, but she kept her focus locked on the reporter, refusing to let him off the hook. She could see the skepticism in his eyes, but she also knew that she was making her case. The truth had been buried for too long, and now she was the one digging it up. All right, the reporter said, his tone shifting to something more critical. Let's talk about another issue that's been raised recently, your partnership with Elon Musk. Many people are wondering why the White House is teaming up with someone who's so controversial. People are asking, what does Musk have to do with government reform? Caroline's gaze never wavered. She had anticipated this line of questioning. Musk isn't just a businessman, he's an innovator. And that's what we need right now, innovation. We need to think outside the box. And that's exactly what President Trump and Elon are doing. Together, they're forcing the government to confront its inefficiencies and put the American people first. The reporter scoffed. So now you're saying that Elon Musk is the solution to all the government's problems? Caroline's expression softened, but only slightly. I'm saying that his ideas, his leadership, have the potential to bring about real change. Unlike previous administrations, which have been content to let the system run its course, President Trump and Musk are determined to turn things around. She could sense the reporter's growing frustration, but she refused to give an inch. This was her moment to stand her ground, to defend everything she believed in. And she was going to do it no matter how many tough questions they threw at her. The camera zoomed in on the reporter, who looked like he was about to unleash another wave of questions. Caroline braced herself, knowing that this was far from over. The fight for transparency, for accountability, had only just begun. And no matter how much the media tried to paint her as the enemy, she would stand tall because the truth was on her side. As the reporter leaned in, ready for his next round of attacks, Caroline was ready too. She had been through this before, but today it felt different. Today, she wasn't just defending the administration, she was defending the future. The next question came like a slap in the face, a challenge that Caroline had anticipated but still felt the sting of. The reporter leaned forward, his eyes sharp with intent. So, if we're to believe that the government is filled with corruption, waste, and inefficiency, tell us, Caroline, why hasn't your administration made any tangible progress in fixing these problems? The question hung in the air, dense with accusation. Caroline didn't flinch. She knew exactly how to respond. She had rehearsed for this, thought through every scenario. Her voice, though calm, had a firmness that made it clear she wasn't about to let this one slide. Well, first of all, this isn't a problem that can be solved overnight, Caroline replied, her gaze unwavering. We've inherited a broken system that has been decades in the making. The previous administrations chose to ignore these issues, let them fester, and now we're the ones dealing with the aftermath. but we're not shying away from it. We're facing it head on. The reporter scoffed. It's easy to point fingers, Caroline, but you've been in office long enough now. Don't you think it's time to deliver results? Your supporters want to see progress, not just promises. Caroline's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, but she kept her composure. This wasn't just about defending the administration. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental. It was about restoring faith in a government that had let its citizens down for far too long. Results are coming, Caroline said slowly, emphasizing each word. You may not see them right now, but they're there. We've already started the process of cutting down wasteful spending. We've started making the necessary changes at the top level. This isn't just about quick wins. It's about long-term change that's sustainable. The reporter raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. And yet, the numbers don't seem to add up. For instance, how do you explain the $2.5 million spent on a cow flatulence reduction program in Brazil? You can't seriously argue that this is where American taxpayer dollars should be going, can you? The room fell silent as the question hung in the air. Caroline felt a flicker of irritation. She had anticipated this, but she had also prepared for it. This was the sort of question that could derail the conversation, but she was determined not to let it. That project is just one example of how the previous administration failed to keep track of foreign aid and international funding, Caroline replied, her voice controlled but firm. We're looking at every single one of these projects to make sure they align with the interests of the American people. It's about making sure that our money goes where it will actually make a difference. The reporter shook his head, a look of disbelief on his face. But $2.5 million for cow flatulence? That's your idea of responsible government spending? Caroline's lips parted slightly, but she remained silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully. What you're failing to understand is that this is part of a larger issue. It's not just about one project, it's about a broken system that allowed these things to happen in the first place. These are the kinds of projects that have been allowed to slip through the cracks, and it's our job to fix it. The reporter leaned back, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. He glanced at his notes, then looked back at Caroline. All right, let's shift gears a bit. You've mentioned Elon Musk and his involvement in your administration's reforms. But let's be clear, Musk has been a controversial figure. Some say his business practices are questionable, and others argue that his influence in government matters is a conflict of interest. How do you respond to those criticisms? Caroline wasn't surprised by the question. She had been waiting for it. The relationship between the White House and Elon Musk had been one of the most talked about topics in recent months. To many, it seemed an odd pairing: Trump, the brash billionaire businessman turned politician, and Musk, the eccentric entrepreneur and innovator. But to Caroline, the partnership made perfect sense. Elon Musk is not just a businessman, he's an innovator, a visionary, she said, her tone growing more passionate as she spoke. He's someone who's thinking ahead, pushing boundaries, and demanding progress. And right now, that's exactly what we need. This isn't about a personal relationship. This is about getting the job done. It's about fixing a broken system. And Elon's the kind of person who isn't afraid to challenge the status quo. The reporter's eyes narrowed. So you're saying that having someone like Musk, with his controversial reputation and personal fortune, is the right way to reform the government? Caroline met his gaze squarely. Yes, I believe it is. Elon Musk's track record speaks for itself. He's taken on some of the most difficult challenges, from launching reusable rockets to revolutionizing electric cars. What's the problem with bringing that same spirit of innovation into the government? I'd say that's exactly what we need right now. The reporter didn't seem convinced, but his involvement raises some serious questions, doesn't it? There are those who argue that Musk is more interested in pushing his own agenda than serving the public interest. Caroline could feel the pressure mounting. The media had been relentless on this issue, painting Musk as someone with too much influence and power. But Caroline knew the truth was far more complicated and far more important than simple headlines. Elon is a businessman, yes, Caroline said, her voice steady, but that's what makes him invaluable in this situation. He's not a career politician. He's not weighed down by the same outdated thinking that has plagued Washington for decades. He brings a fresh perspective, a willingness to take risks, and embrace new ideas. And that's exactly what this country needs right now. The reporter seemed ready to retort, but Caroline wasn't done. And let's be clear, this isn't just about Musk. It's about President Trump's entire approach to governance. It's about accountability, efficiency, and delivering on the promises that were made to the American people. Caroline's words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. The reporter seemed to be considering her response, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. Caroline knew this was her chance to regain control of the narrative. She wasn't just answering questions anymore, she was shaping the story. And let's not forget, Caroline continued, her voice gaining momentum, that President Trump is the one who has consistently pushed for reforms that will benefit the American people. Whether it's cutting wasteful spending, holding bureaucrats accountable, or tackling corruption head-on, the administration is committed to making things right. The reporter opened his mouth to speak, but Caroline held up a hand, signaling for a moment of quiet. "We're doing the work. We've always been doing the work," she said, her voice firm but calm. "And you may not like how it's being done, but change is happening, and we're going to keep pushing until we get the results the American people deserve." The room was silent. The camera panned out briefly, capturing the intensity of the moment. Caroline felt the weight of every word she had said. She had delivered her message. She had made her case. And she wasn't about to let anything, least of all a reporter's skepticism, derail her mission. The air in the studio had grown thick with tension. The exchange between Caroline and the reporter had escalated, each side trying to outmaneuver the other with sharper words and pointed accusations. But Caroline had remained unshaken. She had anticipated this fight from the moment she agreed to appear on this live interview. It was a battle, no less than a public trial of her integrity, her administration's actions, and the forces that sought to undermine them. The reporter's face tightened as he adjusted his glasses and shuffled his notes. Caroline could see that he was gearing up for another round of questions, this time likely more personal, more invasive. But Caroline was ready. There was no room for hesitation in her responses now. The stakes had never been higher, and she wasn't going to let him steer the conversation into territory that would hurt her credibility or distract from the core issues. She was here to make a case not just for the administration, but for transparency, accountability, and reform. So, Caroline, the reporter began, his voice steady. "You've spent a lot of time talking about corruption and inefficiency in the federal system, but let's talk about the people behind this corruption. Many of your critics claim that President Trump's administration is filled with individuals who have personal stakes in the very systems they are supposed to reform. How do you respond to those allegations?" Caroline felt a flicker of irritation, but it was quickly suppressed. She had expected this question. In fact, it was one she had prepared for. How could she not? The notion that the Trump administration was only interested in personal gain was an accusation that had been leveled against her and her colleagues for months. But it was a false narrative, one that she was determined to dismantle. "Criticism of the administration is one thing," Caroline said, her tone now firm, "but accusations of self-interest are baseless and misleading. The president has made it clear time and time again that his primary focus is to put America first. His policies are designed to benefit the American people, not the political elite or the well-connected insiders." The reporter raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "But what about the number of high-profile business figures, people with personal stakes in various industries who are in key positions within your administration? What does that say about the president's commitment to reform?" Caroline took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It says that the president is surrounding himself with the best and brightest minds in business and technology to fix a broken system. These are people who have proven track records of success. Whether it's Elon Musk, a world-renowned innovator, or business leaders with deep expertise in industries like energy, technology, and finance, these individuals bring real-world experience to the table. They know how to create change." The reporter's eyes narrowed. "So you're saying that having business moguls in power isn't a conflict of interest?" "No," Caroline said firmly. "It's an asset. We need people who think outside the box, who aren't constrained by the same old bureaucratic thinking that has held this country back for so long. The idea that business leaders somehow can't serve the public interest is an outdated notion. In fact, it's that very thinking that has kept the government stuck in neutral for decades." The reporter leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated but not willing to give up the line of questioning. "All right, fine. Let's move on. You've spoken about wasteful spending and inefficiencies, but what about the perception that the president's administration is involved in shady dealings? You've seen the headlines, whether it's about the Trump organization or the president's personal finances. How do you explain that away? Caroline's jaw tightened slightly. She had braced for this, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. She had spent years working alongside the president, and she knew that accusations like these were not only unfair, but unfounded. The media had been relentless in their efforts to paint Trump as a figure mired in scandal. But Caroline wasn't about to let the reporter or anyone else distort the truth. The media has a tendency to sensationalize things, she replied evenly. The truth is, President Trump has been open and transparent about his finances. Everything is above board. As for the Trump organization, it's a private business. The president stepped away from the day-to-day operations when he took office, and his focus has been entirely on governing this country. Let's be clear, these are distractions. The real issue here is not Trump's business dealings, it's the broken government that he's fighting to fix. The reporter's lips pressed together in a thin line, clearly unsatisfied with this answer. Distractions, huh? Well, I think a lot of people would argue that the president's financial dealings are hardly a distraction. They're a legitimate concern. Caroline's eyes hardened. A concern? Sure. But it's not the issue at hand today. The issue today is a government that has spent years ignoring the needs of the American people. The issue is a system that has been plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and waste. And that's what we're focused on fixing. The reporter didn't push any further on that front, sensing that the line of questioning was getting him nowhere. Instead, he shifted tactics, clearly trying to pivot back to the Trump-Musk connection. All right, let's get back to Musk then. Many people wonder why someone like Elon Musk is given so much influence in the administration. After all, he's not a politician, he's a businessman. What makes him the right person to lead a national reform effort? Caroline smiled slightly, sensing another opportunity to clarify the narrative. Elon Musk is a visionary. He's the kind of person who can look at a problem and say, how can we solve this in a way that's never been done before? That's exactly what we need right now in government. Someone who isn't bogged down by politics as usual. He's already made breakthroughs in space travel, electric vehicles, and renewable energy. Now, he's turning his attention to something even more complex, the federal bureaucracy. The reporter seemed almost disbelieving. Space travel, electric cars. You're really comparing those things to reforming a broken government? Caroline nodded. Yes, I am. Because the principles behind Musk's approach, innovation, disruption, and a refusal to accept the status quo, are exactly what the federal government needs. Look, I get it. Some people don't like the idea of an outsider shaking up Washington, but that's what we're here to do. And Elon Musk has the vision and the skill set to help make that a reality. The reporter paused, clearly unsure of how to respond. The room seemed to shift, the pressure mounting on him as Caroline's words continued to resonate. She wasn't just defending Musk, she was defending the future, a future that would be shaped by new ways of thinking, by new kinds of leadership. Well, the reporter said, after a long pause, it seems like you've got a lot of faith in Musk's abilities. Caroline's eyes locked with his, her gaze unwavering. I do, and so does the president. Together, they're not just making promises, they're taking action. You'll see the results eventually. And when you do, you'll understand why this partnership is so important. The reporter opened his mouth to speak again, but Caroline raised a hand, signaling that she wasn't finished. One more thing, she said, her voice low but deliberate. I want to remind everyone watching today, the media is quick to criticize, quick to point out flaws. But what they won't tell you is this. Every step we take toward reform, every decision we make, is about one thing, the American people. We're doing this for them, and we're going to keep doing it no matter how many obstacles we face. There was a moment of silence as the full weight of her words settled over the studio. The reporter seemed momentarily speechless, clearly rattled by Caroline's final statement. The camera panned out for a brief moment, catching the intensity of the exchange. As the broadcast continued, the battle of words had only just begun. Caroline knew this interview was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt as though she had made her point. The fight wasn't just about defending her administration, it was about defending the values that had driven her to take this job in the first place. Honesty, integrity, and the unwavering belief that government should work for the people, not against them. The studio lights dimmed slightly as Caroline paused, feeling the weight of the past hour settle in. The rapid-fire questions, the attempts to discredit her, the subtle insinuations, each one was a test. But she had weathered them all with poise. This was the moment when the tide could turn. The reporter, sensing that he had pushed Caroline into a corner without a clear victory, chose a different angle. He cleared his throat, leaning forward, his tone softer now, almost coaxing. "Let's step back for a moment, Caroline," he began, his voice almost apologetic. "I can see you're committed to your cause, but what about the future? Can you assure the American people that all these efforts will lead to tangible results? Can you promise that, in the end, the changes you're pushing for will really fix the system?" Caroline took a deep breath, feeling the intensity of his words sink in. This wasn't about scoring a point or defending an idea. This was about the real work, the hard, often invisible work that would shape the future. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady, eyes locked on the reporters. "I can promise that this administration will deliver results. We've already started the process. You might not see it all yet, but every day we're making progress. This isn't about empty promises. It's about real change, the kind that will take time but will make a difference for generations to come." The reporter nodded slowly, as if processing her answer. The tension in the room had shifted. It wasn't as hostile now. For the first time during the interview, Caroline could sense a subtle shift in the dynamic, a recognition that the administration's efforts were more than just a series of headlines and sound bites. "This will take time," she added, her voice low but filled with conviction. "But we're on the right path, and we're not backing down. Not for anyone." The reporter sat back in his chair, a slight nod of respect breaking through the skepticism. Caroline had made her point. Now, it was up to the American people to decide whether they were ready for change or not. And for the first time in the interview, the room fell quiet, perhaps in acknowledgement of the truth she had just spoken. The interview was drawing to a close, but Caroline could feel the weight of every moment lingering. The questions had been relentless, the scrutiny intense, yet she remained firm in her convictions. As the camera's red light flickered, signaling the final segment, the reporter took a deep breath, looking at her with something resembling newfound respect. "Caroline," he said, his voice softer now, "we've been talking about the president's policies, Elon Musk's role, and the long road to reform. But let's end on a note of clarity. What do you want the American people to take away from this? What is the single most important thing they need to understand about what's happening right now?" Caroline paused, her gaze steady. This was it, the last chance to make her message clear, to leave behind a lasting impression. She could feel the eyes of the country on her, even if only for this brief moment. And she knew she had to make it count. "The most important thing," she began, her voice unwavering, "is that change is possible. The system is broken, yes, but it's not beyond repair. We've spent too long accepting inefficiency, corruption, and waste as the norm. That's not how America works, and that's not how we're going to move forward." She leaned slightly forward, her tone growing more passionate. "We're committed to fixing what's broken, to making government work for the people again. This isn't about a politician's agenda. This is about America's future. We're focused on accountability, transparency, and getting results. And we won't stop until we do." The reporter looked at her, his expression thoughtful. For a brief moment, it seemed like he was considering her words not as an adversary, but as a citizen. A part of him understood the magnitude of what she was saying. "The president has promised the American people real change, and that's exactly what we're delivering," Caroline continued, her voice firm with conviction. "There will be obstacles, there will be setbacks, but we're committed to seeing this through because the American people deserve better. They deserve a government that puts their interests first." The camera zoomed in for the final shot as Caroline finished her statement, her words hanging in the air. There was a palpable shift in the room, a sense of finality, of something having been said that couldn't be unsaid. The interview, once a battleground, had transformed into a declaration of intent, a promise that could not be ignored. The red light blinked off, signaling the end of the interview. The reporter exhaled sharply, perhaps a little surprised by the clarity and power of Caroline's message, but Caroline wasn't finished. As the crew began to pack up, she stood tall, her posture confident and resolute. The fight had only just begun, and as she left the studio, Caroline knew one thing for certain. No matter what the headlines would say tomorrow, she had made her case. The path ahead was long and uncertain, but she was ready to walk it.